Well, today we get a farewell speech from somebody really old going to the grave.
We're going back and looking at some of the details of David's end and Solomon's beginning. So
Yes.
that's what we're talking about today on HC Daily.
You're listening to another episode of HC Daily, a daily devotional podcast that you can listen to at home or on the go. We believe that you can grow as much as you want to grow spiritually, and this podcast can be a part of your daily growth plan. So, whether you're watching on YouTube, listening on Spotify or your favorite podcast app, we're glad you're here. Now, let's join our hosts, Jeff Forrester and Chris Zarbaugh, in the studio.
Hey, well, Jeff.
Chris.
I was thinking about this about, 2 minutes ago.
Wow.
Who's your favorite actor?
My favorite actor. Man, we've done a lot of movie things lately, huh?
Yeah.
So let me see. My favorite actor, probably Harrison Ford.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, you love those Indiana Jones films.
Yeah, I'm an Indiana Jones nut, but I liked him in Han Solo, but I like him in a lot of the other movies too. Yeah.
So
he's got a certain gravitas and intensity about him.
He does.
But he's really good at sarcasm, and sarcasm just busts me up.
Yeah. So many of you don't know this, but when Jeff turned 50, his wife set up a theme party at the church, and it was all based off of Indiana Jones.
Yeah, Indiana Jones stuff. Yep, that's
It's
what I
fun.
like it. So my daughter just committed a family sin the other day when she mentioned she doesn't think she's seen an entire Indiana Jones movie all the way to the end.
Oof.
I was like, what? So, well, it was her boyfriend, actually, was the one who said that. So now the next 4 times he comes to our house, we have to watch Indiana Jones movies.
Did I mention to you at Big Bang Theory how they picked apart Raiders of the Lost Ark?
No.
Big Bang
Oh, yeah, maybe did.
Yeah, where they said, Sheldon gets really excited, shows it to Amy, and Amy says, well, except for the glaring hole in the plot. And he says, what are you talking about? She said, Indiana Jones has absolutely no effect on the plot at all.
Because they were all going to die anyways, right? The Germans?
She said, with or without him, they would have found the Ark, opened it up, and died.
That's the truth.
That's truth. So literally,
but maybe the U.S. government wouldn't have gotten it and put it away in the warehouse.
No, they really would have.
You think they would have? Who else would have done it? Because they sent Indiana Jones to go do that.
Well, actually, they talked about that, and then they gave a reason why. I can't remember.
You don't remember?
They picked it apart.
Well, I'm sure all of our listeners are riveted by this very important movie conversation.
Well, let's talk about David.
Okay. So just as a summary before we get into this passage today, there's something that people sometimes are surprised by, and that is that 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and 1 Chronicles all kind of overlap. Mm-hmm. It's similar to how Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John sometimes tell the same stories,
right?
And they just have different angles or perspectives on it. You kind of have the same thing happening here. So what we've talked about is David coming towards the end. He's 70 years old. He can't hardly stand anymore. Remember that part of it. Then one of Solomon's brothers slips in and tries to pull off a coup. Nathan comes and says, hey, David, you need to, if you're going to make a move on Solomon becoming king, you need to do it right now. So David sends Nathan and one of the priests to go and anoint Solomon and then put Solomon on the throne. And then it ends, David dies, right?
You're
like, wow.
It mentions his death.
Yeah. Well, then when you pick up in 1 Chronicles and in 1 Kings, it's telling more of the details of those stories. And so what happened actually is it looks like he gets anointed king, but he's not coronated king. They don't put the throne, the crown on his head, and the whole nation celebrates. That happens later. Between the time they anoint Solomon king and avert the coup, and the time he actually sits on the throne with the crown on his head, kind of king, David gives him this speech about, hey, I wanted to build the temple and I couldn't. It's your job, right? And that's kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I've always viewed it like the announcement of Solomon as king versus the official coronation of the king,
right?
Because back, if you remember the story from a couple podcasts ago, Adonijah tries that coup, and then it was announced,
right?
They're coming for you because David has announced Solomon as the king. So here's David's final speech. And he actually stands up for this because, we know that he could barely stand at this point, but we're about to read, he's going to stand up and give a charge.
Kind of a long speech, too.
It is a long speech. But you know what, though? Imagine at the end of your life, if you were to give words of wisdom to pass on, especially with this great assignment of building the temple.
Right.
So there's some details in here, but you know, we'll cover it.
He seems to have gotten really energized too, because we'll talk about how he begins to, he began to raise all the resources necessary. But anyways, here's what it says in 1 Chronicles chapter 28. I'll just start with verse 2 because it says in verse 1 all the people he invites to this speech. Verse 2, it says, David rose to his feet and said, my brothers and my people, it was my desire to build a temple where the ark of the Lord's covenant, God's footstool, could rest permanently. I made the necessary preparations for building it, but God said to me, you must not build a temple to honor my name, for you are a warrior and you've shed much blood. Yet the Lord, the God of Israel, has chosen me from among all my father's family to be king over Israel forever. For he has chosen the tribe of Judah to rule, and from among the families of Judah he chose my father's family. And from among my father's sons the Lord was pleased to make me king over all Israel. And from among my sons, for the Lord has given me many, he chose Solomon to succeed me on the throne of Israel and to rule over the Lord's kingdom. He said to me, your son Solomon will build my temple and its courtyards, for I have chosen him as my son, and I will be his father. And if he continues to obey my commands and regulations as he does now, I'll make his kingdom last forever. So now, with God as our witness, and in the sight of all Israel, the Lord's assembly, I give you this charge. Be careful to obey all the commands of the Lord your God, so that you may continue to possess this good land and leave it to your children as a permanent inheritance. And Solomon, my son, learn to know the God of your ancestors intimately. Worship and serve him with your whole heart and a willing mind. For the Lord sees every heart and knows every plan and thought. For if you seek him, you will find him. But if you forsake him, he will reject you forever. So take this seriously. The Lord has chosen you to build a temple as a sanctuary. Be strong and do the work. And then David gave Solomon plans for the temple and its surroundings, including the entry room, the storerooms, the upstairs rooms, the inner rooms, and the inner sanctuary, which was the place of atonement. David also gave Solomon all the plans he had in mind for the courtyards of the Lord's temple, the outside rooms, the treasuries, and the rooms of the gifts dedicated to the Lord. The king also gave Solomon the instructions concerning the work of the various divisions of priests and Levites in the temple of the Lord, and he gave specifications for the items in the temple that were to be used for worship. So we'll pause there. There's some more that I want to read one chapter over, but here, first of all, David is standing. You can imagine they bring Solomon out. There's probably a throne. There's all the leaders, all of the influential people, and David stands up, maybe behind a podium or something. He's an old man. He's so weak, and he begins to give this charge to Solomon, saying, God blessed me, and now God's promising to bless you if you seek him with all your heart.
Yeah. Yeah. So this morning I had breakfast with a good friend of mine, Jerry McLeod, and he was diagnosed with cancer years ago, and he has just fought it every step of the way. And man, he is just one of the most positive, heaven thinking, God loving and fearing people that I know. He's filled with joy, contagious joy. Mm-hmm. And so we were talking about, in the time that he has left, which could be short, just what would you say as your final words to pass on to your children and your grandchildren? Like, think about what would you say? Mm-hmm. So, think about this right over here. We're about to see that David gives this speech. He gives Solomon the charge. And then again, it mentions that David passes, right? And he dies. So, man, so much wisdom comes into this verse when he says, son, above anything else, know the God of your ancestors intimately. And he says he sees the heart. He knows every plan and thought. David is the one who discovered the hard way, that God sees everything, and that, Nathan comes and says, hey, God knows this. The whole kingdom knows this. David has been on the sidelines watching, God's majesty and his sovereignty, his omniscience. Yeah. It just unfolds in front of him. And so he says, learn the lesson that I've spent my life learning. Which is great.
Yeah. He gives in, the life application study notes. I know you've got it in front of you too. I love this book. If you don't have a life study application Bible, you should go get one. I bought mine. Mine's a hardcover. I think I paid like $30. It's not expensive, right? You've got one of those fancy leather ones. Those are expensive.
Yes.
But this one, it's not very expensive. But there's a note here, and it says, King David gave his son Solomon principles to guide him through life. He doesn't give him rules, right? There's a huge difference between rules are for children. But once you get up to being a man, hopefully he's got enough wisdom. He can make decisions based on principles that his dad's passing on. And it says these same principles are the ones that Christian parents should consider passing along to their children. Can also serve as encouragement for anyone you have influence over. So he gives these 6 things. Get to know God personally. Remember, he says, get to know him intimately, is what it said there. Learn God's commands and discover what he's created you to do. Worship God with wholehearted devotion. Serve God with a willing mind. Be faithful and don't become discouraged. Those are the 6 things that David passed on. And buddy, if we can pass those on to our children or anybody that we have influence over, those guiding principles could help us really help the people that we're trying to influence really succeed in life. I think it's brilliant.
That could be a list. I mean, you could make a list and put it on your mirror every day.
Oh, absolutely.
And say to yourself, I got to remind myself of these 6 things personally today.
Yeah.
So it's great.
So David also reminded him in verse 5, he reminds him, he's kind of not bragging, but he's saying, God chose me out of my father's family, and then he chose out of all my sons, he chose Solomon. But it says to rule over the Lord's kingdom. What sets David apart from Saul previously was David did not see the kingdom as his kingdom. He knew it was God's kingdom. And so the kings of Israel did not own that country. And in David's mind, it's God's kingdom. And so he viewed his role, and now he's trying to tell Solomon, your role is to be a good steward over what is God's. And you begin to find that through in the next chapter. As a matter of fact, the next passage we're going to read.
Hey, can you imagine being Solomon? Obviously, he's young here.
Yeah.
And can you imagine the task of your father, who's larger than life?
Oh, yeah.
Who passes on to you this great task. And he had been making preparations to gather materials.
Yeah.
And by the way, tens of thousands of people working tirelessly to ship in materials. David had prepped all of this, knowing that he couldn't build it, but he wanted to, set him up for success.
Yeah.
And can you imagine then, being charged with the task of actually building it?
Yeah.
I mean, this is really probably intimidating for somebody like Samuel.
It's going to be big. Although,
Solomon.
And this is kind of why I wanted to include this passage right here. David knew that God wouldn't let him build the temple. He said because he had bloody hands.
Mm-hmm.
He was a warrior, and God said, I don't want my temple built by a warrior. So David did everything else necessary. He didn't just dismiss it. Sometimes when we're not allowed to do what we want to do, or sometimes when circumstances don't work out in a way that we get to do the thing that we want to do most, and David wanted more than anything to build a temple for God. A lot of times we just go, well, I guess it's not my business. I don't get to do anything. But instead, David worked out every single detail of the temple. As a matter of fact, if you get a little deeper in this chapter, it talks about how he measured out exactly how much gold they were going to need, exactly how much steel they were going to, or iron they were going to need, exactly how much silver they were going to need, exactly how much bronze, exactly how much wood, exactly how much stone. He worked it out, the exact design. He just didn't get to put it all together.
Right.
He did all this work. And so I would say, you know what, if we would stop thinking of our life as being only about our life and understanding that we're a part of this big, long story, we do our part. We get as faithful as we can. We build the plans, knowing that we may hand it off to the next generation. But we do all we can. And this is a big part of us being part of God's kingdom, is you and I may not fulfill the Great Commission in our lifetime, certainly not alone, but we can set up the next generation to go further than we could go. And that could be some of our greatest successes. Isn't the success, the giants we killed in our life and the battles we fought in our life. The greatest success in our life might be that we set up the next generation to go even further and accomplish even more for us.
Well, today it's still known as Solomon's Temple.
Yes.
So I've always believed that we can get a lot done for the Lord if we don't care who gets the credit.
Right.
And so David is allowing his name.
David designed it and collected all the stuff.
Right. Gets no credit. Today it's Solomon's Temple.
Yeah.
So what's really cool for me is I've been to Israel 2009. We went and did this thing. And, there's for a lot of people that don't know this, there's what's known as the Wailing Wall or the Weeping Wall. And it's really the last wall left after Solomon's Temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Mm-hmm. And so when the temple was destroyed, I mean, it lasted from this moment all the way up until 70 AD for thousands of years. And then once it got destroyed, there was only one wall left. Well, today, the strong Jewish faith people who really, really focus on that part of the Old Testament,
right.
They're down there in Israel and they wrap up these prayers and they stick them in the cracks of the wall, and they touch the wall and pray at the wall and everything else. And that part of it, that's fine. I mean, I went down there and I was reverent and everything else. But for me, it was really cool when I touched the walls and I thought, wow, I'm actually touching the bricks that we're reading about here in First Chronicles.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Which is really, really cool.
Let's jump over to chapter 29 here in First Chronicles, because it kind of gives a little bit of the glory, just a little bit of what the plan is. So if you start in verse 1, it says, Then King David turned to the entire assembly and said, My son Solomon, whom God has clearly chosen as the next king of Israel, which is very strategic politically, he's clearly chosen as the next king of Israel, is still young and inexperienced. The work ahead of him is enormous. For the temple he will build is not for mere mortals. It is for the Lord God himself. Using every resource at my command, I have gathered as much as I could for building the temple of my God. Now there is enough gold, silver, bronze, iron, and wood, as well as great quantities of onyx and other precious stones, costly jewels, and all kinds of fine stone and marble. And now, because of my devotion to the temple of my God, I'm giving all of my own private treasures of gold and silver to help in the construction. This is in addition to the building materials I've already collected for this holy temple. I'm donating more than 112 tons of gold. 112 tons of gold from Ophir, 262 tons of refined silver to be used for overlaying the walls of the buildings, and for the other gold and silver work to be done by the craftsmen. Now then, who will follow my example and give offerings to the Lord today? Then the family leaders, the leaders of the tribes of Israel, and generals and captains of the army, and the king's administrative officers all gave willingly for the construction of the temple of God. They gave about 188 tons more of gold, 10,000 gold coins, 375 tons of silver, 675 tons of bronze, and 3,750 tons of iron. They also contributed numerous precious stones, which were deposited in the treasury of the house of the Lord under the care of Jehiel, a descendant of Gershon. The people rejoiced over the offerings, for they had given freely and wholeheartedly to the Lord, and King David was filled with joy. Then, when you go down just a little further, he begins to say this big prayer about how we don't feel like we're deserving of the fact that we could give what we gave to God. But he says, "O Lord, the God of our ancestor Israel, may you be praised forever. Yes, O Lord, is the greatness of power, the glory, the victory, and the majesty. Everything in the heavens and on earth is yours, O Lord, and this is your kingdom. We adore you as the one who is over all things. Wealth and honor come from you alone, for you rule over everything." So David's saying, we only gave back to you what was already yours.
Right.
God, what a blessing. He goes on and he says, who are we, mere mortals, that we get to give this back to you, God? And he's just celebrating. And it's one of those things where you get this moment, because we've talked a little bit about how David made some bad choices and it cost him so much. But when he's standing up talking about how he loves God and his faith in God, he's recognizing everything comes from God and what a great pleasure and joy it is to give. And all the people were inspired by that. So if you add up all the money, which I started to do today, he gave upwards of $2 billion in modern money of his own money for the temple, and then the people followed in behind him and exceeded that.
My thought went to, like, the man who built Little Caesars Arena would probably be blown away by the number of tonnage of materials here. He probably thought, well, geez, only somebody like that who would be in charge of something so large would be able to truly understand this, right?
Yeah.
So those in the industry of building, when they read this, they're probably sitting at home or in their cars or whatever, and their minds are racing, going, "This is unbelievable." Because 112 tons of, like, I think my car weighs like a ton. Yeah, I think it does, or maybe 3/4 of a ton.
A couple
right?
tons, probably.
Okay, so either way, though, I mean, it's a pretty small car.
Yeah. That's true.
It's a Equinox or whatever, right? So anyway, so you imagine 112 of those of solid gold.
Gold, yeah.
It's just crazy.
And then the people stepped up and gave, 160 tons more?
Well, 300, right. And then 375 tons of silver.
Yeah.
And then 3,700 tons of iron?
Yeah.
Are you kidding me?
Just amazing. So you can imagine how spectacular the temple is. David's not just going halfway.
Yeah.
And what I love about it is he's been spending his entire career as king collecting this stuff, right? It all had a purpose. He benefited from it. I mean, he's giving it in his old age, right? He's giving it towards the end of his life. He benefited from being wealthy. He benefited from all those things. But he says in this long prayer that everybody should read, it's from verse 10 to about verse 20. And he's saying, God, everything I have is yours. Everything that you are the creator of everything, and all the blessings I have is because of you. So here it is. I bring it back, and I'm just laying it at your feet. And then the people were inspired by that. And it was just so spectacular. So David's not feeling guilty that he was fabulously wealthy. Instead, he just made sure at the end that he was a blessing and that the God's kingdom could keep going, that it wasn't just hoarded, right? Eventually, Solomon becomes fabulously wealthy as well, and we'll talk about that in a future podcast. But I just love the fact that what he wants to do is not just, he was an incredibly successful king. He was incredibly prosperous, but at the end, what he was wanting to do is leave a legacy. And I think that's probably one of the best things we can think of out of this passage is prepare, do everything we can to pass on to the next generation. But then how do we leave a legacy? How do we leave an impact? How do we give our life over for not just success, but significance? And this was a significant move in David's life to make sure he gave it all to God.
Yeah, and things existed well beyond his lifetime for God's glory.
Yeah.
So whenever you invest in things that are eternal, and every time you give money, for instance, to plant a church somewhere in the middle of India, or you give money for a building project for a church right here in Macomb County, which is the county we live in. Every time you give toward that, just know that when you're long gone, Lord willing, those things will continue on, and we have no idea the impact that will last beyond our lifetime and the ripple effects of our investment. And God can take everything that we lay at his feet and just magnify it and use it for great things.
Yeah. So it's an inspiring thing to me. When we were getting ready to do the renovation for the children's space and the teen space, my wife and I stepped up and gave the largest gift to that. We don't have tons of money, but we decided, you know what? We wanted a portion of our legacy for the rest of our lives to have been that we invested heavily in children and families. And then as a result of that, lots of other families at Heritage Church stepped up and did the same thing and sacrificed to make it happen. It's just necessary. Every generation makes sacrifices to move God's kingdom forward on the behalf of the next generation. That's why we do it. It's not just for us. The gospel came to us on the way to somebody else. And so maybe my resources are for the same purpose. Came to me on the way to some other cause.
Well, I think that's a great thought to end with.
Yeah.
And so we'll continue next time on HD Daily.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us spread the word by liking this episode and sharing it on your social media platforms. Be sure to leave a comment and review, and don't forget to give us 5 stars. When you do, you help us reach even more people who need a daily devotional like HC Daily. If you'd like to hear more from Chris and Jeff, they're both teaching pastors at Heritage Church, located in Southeast Michigan. You can get more of their messages by clicking on the Messages tab at heritagechurch.com. Be sure to join us again soon for another episode of HC Daily.